Hello, and welcome to Compliance and Awareness Training on the PWFA, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. This presentation is a 1-hour training so that we can learn how to better support our pregnant school professionals. Today's training objectives is to understand the legal framework and the evolution from laws like Title VII under the Civil Rights Act up to the current PWFA, which was enacted in 2023. Is to better understand the rights and duties of the employer and the employee. It's to review the interactive process, which is mastering good faith dialogue regarding pregnancy accommodations. And it is to understand noncompliance through real-world examples of settlements. First, let's look at foundations, which is the path to PWFA and understanding the legal landscape that brought us here. As part of the evolution of rights that impact pregnant workers, let's look at the 1964 Title VII Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination and harassment in the workplace for protected classes. In a moment, we'll dive into what those protected classes are. In 1978, the PDA, or Pregnancy Discrimination Act, was enacted, and it provided the same protections as Title VII, but for pregnant workers, allowing them a safe place to work free of discrimination and harassment. Again, we'll dive further into what that looks like. And then in 1990, the ADA was formed. This focused on rights for disabled workers, allowing them to make reasonable accommodations in the workplace so that they can perform the essential duties of their role. In 1993, the Department of Labor, through its Wage and Hour Division, rolled out FMLA. This is the Family Medical Leave Act. This is job-protected leave to cover a serious health condition for an employee or that of an immediate family member for which they're a caretaker. And in 2023, we come to the PWFA, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which mandates accommodations much like the ADA, and it is really based on all of the acts preceding it. The acts on the screen were all are under the authority of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, with the exception of FMLA, which, as I said, is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Labor. Looking at the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this act prohibits job discrimination and harassment in the workplace against any individual on the basis of race, religion, color, sex, and now that includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and pregnancy status, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act is enforced to protect employees that identify as these classes from discrimination in hiring practices, employment terms, and conditions. That means that an employer cannot discriminate against an employee, for example, for his or her race in hiring, or his or her religion in promotion. Any ability of the any time the employer would discriminate against an employee, it would be a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and may also constitute retaliation. If a worker complains or files a grievance for discrimination and harassment and then is treated differently than other workers, this could constitute retaliation. One example could be that a person of another religion applies to a predominantly Christian workplace and is not hired due to their religion. That would be a violation of the Civil Rights Act, for example. Next, this led us to the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which covered discrimination and harassment protection for pregnant workers and disallowed employers from discriminating against pregnant workers due to their status as pregnant. So, for example, it would be illegal to refuse to hire someone simply because they are pregnant, or to refuse them a promotion to a new role, even though they may qualify or be the most qualified candidate simply because they are pregnant. It could also look like refusing them merit because they were pregnant and missed a portion of the year due to pregnancy concerns. So, to abide by the PDA, an employer must protect pregnant workers from discrimination and harassment within their employment practices. Next, we have Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. The ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability, and it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees or job applicants with a disability unless the accommodation causes an undue hardship to the organization. We're going to discuss what reasonable accommodations and undue hardships look like as they pertain to the PWFA, but the PWFA is very closely linked to ADA. Also, with each of these acts, supervisors have a role to inform employees that they may need to speak with HR for certain protections, such as requesting accommodations due to a disability. Next, we have the Family Medical Leave Act, which is governed by the Department of Labor rather than the EEOC like the other acts. It consists of 12 weeks of job protected leave for your own serious medical condition or that of an immediate family member. And this also includes time off for birth, adoption, and foster parenting. This act has different qualifications for both the organization and the employee compared to other acts. For example, an employee must have worked for 12 months and 1,250 hours to qualify for FMLA. The organization, in order to be covered by FMLA, should have more than 50 employees in a 75-mile radius. There are other qualifications for covered entities, but that's the most important part to know. And it is the job of a supervisor to recommend that an employee speak with HR to apply for FMLA if the employee is out frequently due to a chronic medical condition, has missed more than 3 days due to a serious medical condition, or needs to take care of a parent or child for a serious medical condition, for example. Therefore, there are certain trigger words that a supervisor should listen to and refer the employee to HR to apply for FMLA where it is relevant. Taking a journey through these laws, you may be able to identify why the PWFA was needed. A gap was really identified for pregnant workers, whereas they may not have been considered disabled enough to qualify for ADA accommodations, and they needed minor adjustments to their job to be able to continue working due to the limitations that pregnancy may have caused them medically. So the PWFA was mandated to provide accommodations for known limitations, even if they don't arise to the level of a disability or are very temporary, unlike many disabilities. The PWFA has basic provisions, and we'll break these down. The PWFA requires a covered entity to provide a reasonable accommodation to a qualified employer applicant with a known limitation related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, absent an undue hardship. These words in bold will be broken down for you. Also, sources may be seen in the bottom of each slide. A covered entity is any employer that is a private employer, as well as states and localities with at least 15 employees. It also covers federal agencies, unions, employment agencies, and entities covered under GERA, the Government Employee Rights Act. Those are the covered entities. A known limitation means that it's a mental or physical condition related to or arising out of pregnancy, childbirth, or something related to pregnancy that has been communicated to the employer. That is an important aspect because the condition must be communicated to the employer for the employer to act. The broad scope is that conditions can be minor, modest, or episodic. Fatigue, nausea, morning sickness, pains, back pains, many things that could be related to pregnancy. The condition does not necessarily have to meet the definition of a disability under the ADA, but oftentimes it may. Here's an example of related medical conditions covered under the PWFA if they were related to pregnancy. It is a non-exhaustive list, and it comes from the EEOC. Gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, hyperemesis gravidarum, sciatica or lumbar lordosis, carpal tunnel syndrome, postpartum depression, anemia, termination of pregnancy such as miscarriage or stillbirth, lactation concerns, menstruation concerns, antenatal anxiety, or chronic migraines. Again, a condition can be physical or mental related to pregnancy. Who is a qualified employee? A qualified worker is someone that can perform the essential functions with or without an accommodation. That is qualified under the ADA. However, the PWFA expands this definition and says the employee is still qualified even if they cannot perform an essential function, provided that this inability is temporary, that the function can be performed again in the near future, and the inability can be reasonably accommodated. A reasonable accommodation under the PWFA generally meets the definition of the ADA's reasonable accommodation, which is a change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done. And it's reasonable if it seems plausible or feasible without an undue burden to the employer. An undue burden looks like extreme cost, extreme engineering, extreme disruption, something that is very difficult to accommodate. Under the ADA, an accommodation has to be effective and it has to help the worker overcome the problem they are facing, which is typically going to be related to the essential job duties. Examples of reasonable accommodation: additional, longer, or more flexible breaks to drink water, to eat, to rest, or to use the restroom. Changing food or drink policies to allow a worker to have a water bottle or food. For example, there are some food safety jobs, for example, food manufacturing, in which it would not be customary to eat or drink near food. So longer or more flexible extra breaks could be a reasonable accommodation for a pregnant worker who must step away from food manufacturing and must eat or drink more often. If it is not customary, say in customer service, to have a water bottle, providing a water bottle to a pregnant worker might be a reasonable accommodation. Changing equipment, devices, or workstations, such as providing a stool to sit on or a way to do work while standing. So sometimes A pregnant worker might be very uncomfortable and may need to sit or stand for less time and mix it up a little more. Therefore, providing a stool or a chair or standing desk may be a reasonable accommodation. Changing the uniform or dress code or providing extra safety equipment that fits differently for this pregnant worker. So some jobs are safety conscious, and therefore special safety equipment may need to be adapted for a reasonable accommodation. Changing a work schedule, such as having shorter hours or later start date, and in some cases even going from full-time to part-time, may be examples of a reasonable accommodation. Additionally, telework for some positions could be a reasonable accommodation. Temporary reassignment to another role, leave for appointments with healthcare professionals, light duty, or help with lifting or other manual labor, and leave to recover from childbirth. For example, a physical education teacher may be required to lift 30 or 40 pounds, but the doctor has restricted them to lifting 10 pounds due to pregnancy. A reasonable accommodation would be to provide them an assistant that can lift heavier objects or provide them tools and equipment that does the lifting for them. Here at KIPP, we're mostly dealing with accommodations in the classroom. There may need to be physical adjustments, reducing standing time, access to extra seating, lifting limit exceptions, maybe closer parking or workstation adjustments to better fit the pregnant worker. A flexible schedule, which we've discussed as more frequent breaks, modified work hours, and restroom access, and role changes, which again is temporary reassignment of duties or a transfer to another role. It's important to note that if there is a reassignment, the wages should not be adjusted if this is part of a reasonable accommodation and it is temporary. Leave can also be a reasonable accommodation. Leave may be needed for appointments with healthcare professionals, recovery from childbirth, or other reasons related to pregnancy, childbirth, and medical conditions for a pregnant worker. A worker may have protection under other laws. FMLA often intersects with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Therefore, if a worker has a right to take leave under FMLA, there may be no need for a reasonable accommodation. What is an undue hardship? An employer is not required to provide an accommodation if it causes significant difficulty or expense. This would be an undue hardship. So factors to consider is the nature and cost of the accommodation. Are there financial resources to cover this accommodation? Operational disruption. Does this accommodation impact student learning or safety or impact other workers? Staffing levels. Is there an ability to reassign duties without burdening others? All of this has to be considered by the employer, and it is part of what we call the interactive process. So let's dive in a little bit deeper to the PWFA process and the rights. The interactive process is step by step. First, the employee has to communicate their limitation that is impeding their essential job duties, and they must notify their supervisor and or HR. Then we enter the dialogue phase, which is the interactive process. There should be a good faith discussion between HR and the employee. Both parties should participate. Then we need to identify and explore potential accommodations that could help the pregnant worker. And then we need to implement them or properly put a solution into place in a timely manner. So the core requirements of the PWFA are to provide reasonable accommodations for known limitations, to have an interactive process that is a two-way dialogue, and to ensure that the employee is qualified, meaning that they can perform the essential functions with or without an accommodation, or their inability is temporary. The employee has core obligations, first to report their need for accommodations. They must participate in the two-way dialogue, which is the interactive process. And if necessary, they must provide medical documentation to HR as part of the reasonable request, and they must do it timely. If it is necessary, there are certain medical documentation that may be quite obvious. The medical documentation rules state that employers should not request documentation for self-evident needs. It may be obvious that a pregnant worker needs to sit or stand varied while working. It may be obvious that they need to carry water or take extra breaks for restroom or eating or drinking or lactation or pumping needs. So medical documentation should only be requested when it is reasonable to confirm a limitation that may not be obvious. The employer obligations are to initiate the interactive process once an employee reports a concern and their need for an accommodation. The employers should engage in this good faith dialogue. Most of the time, problems are caused because one party or another does not engage in the interactive process. An employer should not force leave if another reasonable accommodation exists. For example, in some workplaces, it would be completely reasonable to sit down even though the policy and practice is to stand. For example, retail. Cashiers typically stand and walk the floor. Perhaps a pregnant worker in retail requests sitting down. An employer could not say, "I'm sorry, we don't allow seated employees on the floor, therefore you must take leave." This would be a violation of the PWFA because they did not enter the interactive process and they forced a leave. Anti-retaliation. Anti-retaliation prohibits adverse actions against employees for requesting or using accommodations. In other words, in the example I just provided, let's assume that a chair was provided to a cashier in a retail space. However, this made other workers angry and they were hostile toward this worker. This would be retaliation, and it would be very important that the employer has a no retaliation policy. The interactive process is a collaboration, and both parties should collaborate to identify reasonable accommodations that don't cause an undue hardship and allow the employee to continue performing their job effectively. It's important to note that employees can make verbal requests. There are no special magic words that they need to say to HR. They don't have to use the word accommodation or reasonable accommodation. They should just make their request known, and these requests can be taken in verbally or in writing, either way. It's very important that supervisors and HR are notified promptly so that the accommodation and interactive process can begin. And the EEOC expects the process to be reasonably prompt. Typically, that means medical documentation, if required, should be submitted within 15 days, and decisions should be made within 15 days once the interactive process is complete. The faster, the better. Open communication and dialogue throughout the process is what is most important. Next, we're going to look at some case summaries. These are real-life cases where settlements were incurred because of non-compliance. In the first case, example 1, we have a luxury resort worker. A hotel employee requested leave for recovery and grieving following a stillbirth in her 5th month of pregnancy. Sadly, the resort terminated the employee shortly after her leave request. This violated the PWFA and the ADA. The resort agreed to pay $100,000 in damages and entered a 3-year consent decree. The resort must now appoint an EEO coordinator, an equal employment opportunity coordinator, to revise all accommodation policies and provide training to all staff. The key lesson here is that leave itself can be a reasonable accommodation, and termination following an accommodation request is often viewed as illegal retaliation. In this case, this worker needed time off to grieve and likely heal physically. This case number is in the bottom right of your screen. If you would like to learn more about this specific case, you can look it up online. Example 2. This is a landscape and nursery company. A pregnant employee requested maternity leave in September 2023 with expectation that she would return to work after giving birth. After birth, she was told no work was available. However, the employer hired new non-pregnant workers both before and after her attempted return. This employer was forced to pay out $40,000 in monetary relief to resolve the EEOC lawsuit. The company will implement and disseminate to all employees a policy prohibiting pregnancy discrimination and provide training to all supervisors, managers, and other employees on the policy and requirements of the Title VII and the PWFA. The key lesson here is that employers cannot treat pregnancy leave as a reason to quietly eliminate or deny an employee's job. In other words, when a pregnant worker has time off after giving birth, they need to be restored to an equal or the same job. They cannot be displaced simply because they were pregnant. This case number is in the bottom right, and you may look it up online to learn more as well. Let's move on to example 3, a medical office. A medical assistant with a high-risk pregnancy requested simple accommodations, sitting breaks, and part-time work. The company instead forced unpaid leave and then later termination. Violations of the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act and Americans with Disabilities Act were incurred, and the company agreed to pay $90,000. They also entered a 4-year consent decree with the EEOC requiring accommodation tracking systems, updated policies, supervisor training, and monitoring by the EEOC. Employers must provide reasonable pregnancy accommodations instead of forcing leave or termination. In this case, they could have allowed the person more breaks and a part-time schedule rather than forcing them to take an unpaid leave. This is a summary of key protections and prohibitions for the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act. Again, no forced leave. We cannot require employees to take leave if there is another accommodation available. Leave can be an accommodation, but it is not the only accommodation. No retaliation. This prohibits adverse actions such as demotion, penalty, firing for requesting accommodations. We cannot allow other employees to retaliate, and as supervisors, we cannot retaliate. There is no denial of opportunity, meaning that employers cannot deny employment based on the need for an accommodation. Therefore, if a pregnant worker is applying to a role and says, I'm going to need 6 weeks off next month, we cannot deny employment if they were otherwise qualified for employment. That doesn't mean we have to select that person, but that cannot be the basis for which they are disqualified. A safe environment. It guarantees the right to work without discrimination or fear of harassment. That really is the bottom line. We want pregnant workers to have a safe environment that allows them the right to work without discrimination, without harassment, allowing them to receive the care that they deserve through their medical provider. Next, we'll do a verbal quiz. At the conclusion of this training, there is reading material which you will download and read for more information on the PWFA, and you will take your own quiz. So listen up. There might be some clues. Some of these questions might be repeated. Question 1. What is the primary purpose of the PWFA? A. It focuses on disability rights. B. It's job protective leave. C. It mandates accommodations. D. It prohibits job discrimination. We've discussed laws around all 4 of these, but the PWFA primarily mandates accommodations for pregnant workers. Question 2. The PWFA covers private employers of 15 or more employees. Is that true or false? That is true. Private employers, as well as states and localities of 15 or more employees, are part of the entities that are covered. Question 3. What are considered reasonable accommodations? A. Additional, longer, or more flexible breaks to drink water, eat, rest, or use the restroom. B. Temporary reassignment. C. Changing a work schedule. Or D. All of the above. And the answer is D. All of the above. These are all reasonable accommodations under the ADA, as we discussed, flexible breaks, reassignments, or change of work schedule. Question 4. Which is a core requirement of the PWFA? A. Temporary limits are excluded. B. Interactive accommodation process. C. No accommodations allowed. D. Accommodations are optional. Which is a core requirement? It would be B. Interactive accommodation process. That is the core component. Question number 5. What is a core employee obligation in the accommodation process? A. Participate in dialogue. B. Ignore HR requests. C. Refuse documentation. Or D. Delay reporting needs. Core employee obligation is A. Participate in dialogue. For more information on the PWFA, please visit the eeoc.gov/PWFA site online or contact your HR department for support. Don't go anywhere. This course is not done yet. You have some required reading that includes more information on the PWFA and a 10-question quiz, as well as your local policy. Next, we will read your local policy. Here is your policy statement. Pursuant to the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act, or PWFA, KIPP Atlanta Schools provides reasonable accommodations for known limitations related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on business operations. Discrimination, harassment, or retaliation based on pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions is prohibited. This policy applies to employees and applicants with known limitations related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. All employment stages, including hiring, promotion, job assignments, and leave. Definitions. Known limitation. A physical or mental condition related to, affected by, or arising out of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions that has been communicated to the employer. Reasonable accommodation. A modification or adjustment to the work environment or job duties that enables an employee to perform essential job functions or remain safely employed. An employee in need of accommodation should promptly notify Human Resources. Again, this is your local policy statement for the PWFA. We additionally have this informational sheet for Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. As part of this training, you are required to read this document. It has sections about general information, applicability, protections and covered conditions, prohibitions, in other words, what covered employers must not do, reasonable accommodations, and examples of those, qualified employee or applicant definitions, and links to understand more from the EEOC directly. This informational sheet is provided by Virgil HR, a compliance system. And lastly, there will be a 10-question quiz, which you will need to complete in order to complete this 1-hour training. Thank you so much for your time. I am Sarah Bordeaux with Purposed HR, and these references all came directly from the EEOC website as well as the Virgil HR compliance system. Thank you and have a wonderful day.